Water infrastructure, of course, critical in our country. Water scarcity, a big problem for us. The issue is we don't seem to do a very good job at infrastructure management and maintenance. So government recently establishing the Water Partnership Office. It falls within the Developmental Bank of Southern Africa. The idea is to make it easier, quicker and more affordable for municipalities to enter into partnerships with the private sector without having to reinvent the wheel each and every single time, which takes a lot of time to get done. There's concern that many municipalities are failing to maintain their water structure. So are there any risks involved in this? Well, it's always good to have Chris Hutton, Head of Policy Analysis at the Centre for Risk Analysis, to unpack this for me this evening. Hello to you, Chris. Hope you're warm in Johannesburg. Looks like you are. Give me a sense. So when you look at something like this, I'm not sure where the risk would be in this. It sounds like it's a good plan. Let's get everybody talking. Let's get rid of the red tape and the bureaucracy. But as we know, anything with government and municipalities, there's always a little bit of a snag somewhere.
Good evening, Gareth. Yes, definitely a move in the right direction, I think. One should hope for clear communication, clear transparency, clear deadlines. I don't think maybe we as citizens, we get rightly frustrated. We pay our taxes, so we should want good service delivery. But for the time being, maybe we should not expect everything to be solved overnight. So maybe certain priorities could be clearly ratified. Those could be agreed upon between the municipalities and the different businesses, civil society organizations involved. And then everyone across the board could be held to account if those deadlines and targets are not met. So don't promise us the world that everything will be solved. Identify clear targets that can be achieved realistically within budgets, all that sort of thing, within the necessary skills, the equipment, the capacities. And then we proceed from there. Just as infrastructure quality has declined over time, so too can it be maintained and built up again over time. But you need to reverse that process at the sort of nucleus, as it were, and then we can see improvement again over time.
So what I'm hearing is you almost need to go back to the drawing board, almost reinvent the wheel to stop having to reinvent the wheel down the road. Let's get back to basics and work on what is clearly very bad communication. So what is the risk with something like this? When you would have read this statement, what does Chris Hutton sit back and notice first?
I guess the biggest question would be, firstly, sort of who gets to be in the room. So who gets to draw up certain agreements? Where does the ultimate power lie? Does it still lie with certain government departments? Does it lie with big corporates, for example? Where does civil society factor in, local communities? All those different aspects. I'm not trying to say it's easy particularly, but those aspects and avenues have to be taken in mind if you want a sustainable long-term process, if you don't want to sort of plaster over the cracks and say that things are being solved, and then within a year's time, again after the elections, things sort of start to fall apart even faster. So let's see now what the clear deliverables are, what the timelines are, and from that on, we can then build upon that. So perhaps looking at best practice in other places around the world, let's see maybe if certain municipalities perform better than others, sort of try and do a plug and play model where you can within reason, within your resource constraints. Don't assume, of course, that because one thing happens in one area, it will necessarily happen in others. You've got different community needs, different pressures, different population sizes, all that sort of thing. Maybe in certain areas infrastructure has been better maintained than in others. So you need to assess what you have in front of you. But you can't do that without the information, without the data. So hopefully these sorts of agreements would help in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Some areas historically just might be worse off than others as well. They might need even more attention. Then I suppose it depends which partners get involved with which municipalities as well. You and I have spoken for many, many years, not just you and I, but you and many, many people in the media have spoken about infrastructure. And you've been saying this for ages, that we're going to get to a point where we're not going to be able to recover some of our infrastructure by bringing in these public and private initiatives. Could we be at a point now, Chris, where this is a final Hail Mary to get our infrastructure back on track? Are we at a precipice, if you will?
I think it might be too easy for me to tell you, by this date, we have to turn it around completely, because I think things happen on a gradient, on a sort of spectrum. So you reach different points of failure, different points of exceedingly better or exceedingly worse. Some points maybe will be a little bit better. So I'm not going to tell you, at any point the situation is completely irreversible. But the more you delay and the more you put off doing the sort of hard basic work, the more then capital expenditure you have to expend over the long run, the more you really then have to throw everything in your budget, including the kitchen sink, at fixing things. So when you do the work now, the groundwork, that ensures long-term sustainability and longevity for these systems. It's not a given that we have good infrastructure. All this sort of thing has to be maintained. That's the case around the world. One, unfortunately, doesn't just have infrastructure sort of falling out of the sky. You need to maintain it and upgrade it, obviously, where your budget can allow. So hopefully now these partnerships between public and private sector open up the spaces for that sort of thing to happen. And South Africa's case, as you rightly mentioned, the water scarcity, if you look at, for example, at the end of June, just how full our dams were, but the amount of leakage that we have, the amount of wastage. At the end of June, South Africa's dams were over 95% capacity, but in many places, including in KZN, people don't have water for however many days on end. That shouldn't be the case. So if you've got the capacity in the dams, make sure you fix some of the basics with the piping. The power stations, of course, are an issue. The pumping stations, when there's longer load shedding, make sure you have some sort of backup systems for that, so that you don't lose what you've built up over time. You don't lose that work that has been done.
Yeah, I heard a great discussion on radio the other day about this very issue, and one of the experts called it a dam problem, as in dams and rivers. I thought that was a very clever way of explaining that. Chris, let me just ask you this then. If someone's watching now, they're in the private sector, they're involved in this kind of infrastructure work, or at least they feel they could be involved in some kind of infrastructure work through this Water Partnership Office. They get hold of Chris Hutton and say, Chris, I saw you talking to Gareth. I want to get involved with government. What should I be looking out for? What are the red flags? What are the questions I should be asking in closing?
I think it's essential to make sure that whatever agreements one comes to are clearly communicated and openly so with all the given stakeholders. So if you, for example, would want to get involved in this sort of initiative, make sure that you understand what concessions you are giving up. If you want to invest in publicly government-owned infrastructure, for example, would it be the case with the railways where Transnet is calling for investment, but Transnet remains the custodian of infrastructure? So then where's your return on investment? Profit should not be the overriding complete factor, but it is a consideration. Do you get a return on your investment? Is that part of the agreement? Do you give up over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, certain rights, certain agreements in terms of control of that investment in infrastructure? And are you comfortable with that sort of thing? How then do you hold government, for example, to account? So there's a lot of potential here. I think a lot of reason to also be somewhat careful, just again, given maybe the push for this sort of thing is with the elections next year in sight. So government wants to look like it's doing something. That isn't to say that the motivations aren't good, but take into consideration that context, look at the medium to longer term, and keep everyone around the table to certain agreeables, certain timelines. And then hopefully over time, one can start to slowly but surely maintain what you can maintain and upgrade, especially for those people who don't have access to running water, which in 2023 definitely should not be the case.
Yeah, it's going to be one of the big hot potatoes for next year's elections, the availability of drinkable water and electricity. Never in my life did I think this is what we'd be talking about this late in the 20s and 2019s. But Chris, thank you very much indeed. It's going to be a big issue as far as elections are concerned, as I'm sure you agree with Chris, everything that you're hearing now from municipalities, from mayors, MECs, MMCs, government, whatever it might be, has to be looked at within the framework of the fact that it is a national election next year as well. So when you look at timelines, make sure they're in place well beyond the elections. Chris Hattingh is Head of Policy Analysis at the Centre for Risk Analysis. My thanks for his time. Now, let's